read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And Deputy Speaker, it's a privilege to be able to speak in support of the Private Health Insurance Legislation Amendment Age of Dependents Bill 2021. And the reason I speak in support of this bill is because it is such a simple but critically important measure in understanding the slipstream of young Australians' lives and the relationship and the bond that we have to each other, where many young Australians logically will be raised under the protection of their parents' private health insurance. They will finish school, they will go on to tertiary education or some other form of skills or trade, or an apprenticeship, and they'll continue to be covered by their parents' private health insurance. But of course, once they hit the age of 21 or cease to study, they will then lapse out of the system. Exactly when we need them to be taking responsibility for their health care as part of a holistic protection of themselves, health care protection of themselves over their whole lives. And many people then young people only re-opt into the system when they find there's a financial penalty if they choose not to around the age of 30. So this legislation is bridging that divide and that gap where young Australians who either continue to study or their parents are happy to support and assist them in the coverage of their private health insurance as dependents until they can bridge or walk the bridge to the age of 30 and be able to pay for it themselves, are able to do so. And I say that as a member who has one of the highest concentrations of private health insurance in the country, where almost everybody, young or old, has some form of private health coverage. In fact, it was once pointed out to me by the private health insurance industry that there are more private health insurance policies in my electorate than constituents, which shows you how much the people of Goldstein value their private health insurance, and I suspect that's partly because there are non-citizens who have private health insurance as well. And so many of those young people in the Goldstein community from parts of all of Bayside and Glen Ira will go through their secondary education covered by their parents' private health insurance. They'll go off, as I said, and live perhaps somewhere more proximate to tertiary education. And at that time, while they're there, they'll have coverage until they go into the workforce. And while they're starting out with other competing pressures, as the previous speaker spoke about, it might be the first thing on the chopping block because they think that, of course, at that age, I'm 41 and I still think I'm invincible, but certainly at the age of 21 or 22 or all the way through your mid-20s, you generally are less concerned, of course, about your healthcare unless you have a pre-existing condition. So, of course, this legislation will help those young Australians bridge that divide so that they continue to be covered by private health insurance, and if they need assistance and care at that time, they'll be able to get it through the benefits of their parents who continue to recognise them as dependents for this purpose. But the previous speaker made a critical point, which is that if you've got private health insurance and you have a pre-existing condition, particularly as you're young, even if you go into adulthood, you may need to continue to get that support and that service. So for young people with a disability who may need extra assistance, we are here and we are backing them. If you have another condition which may have occurred in your youth and continues through to your your adolescence and young adulthood, you will continue to get the support from your parents' private health insurance because the Morrison government is backing you and being able to access the services that you need. But more critically, it will help the sustainability of the private health system for every Australian. Because, of course, most young Australians contribute to the private health insurance and don't need to draw much down from it until they get older in their age. Of course, older Australians tend to need to draw down on it more because they've invested in their health insurance at the younger point of their lives when they know there's a lower profile of risk, and carry that all the way through till the latter stage of their life where they know there's a higher degree of risk. And that journey is not dissimilar for the overwhelming number of Australians who are dependent on private health insurance. So this helps us in not just supporting young Australians today, but supporting young Australians as they reach the age where they have children themselves or get married and have dependents, and of course to ensure that there's a sustainable private health insurance at the latter arc of their life where they can continue to rely on a system that's affordable and accessible. And the previous speaker actually did raise a legitimate issue around the economic challenges facing young Australians, which leads many of them to say on their priority list between the early ages of 20 to 30, whether private health insurance is at the fore. And of course it is because young Australians face challenges, and particularly economic challenges, both because of employment arrangements, around needing to pay rent while they're concurrently trying to save to buy their first home. But conveniently he forgot one factor, which is the compulsion that they have 10% of their wage taken from them and locked up into a fund controlled by, in many cases, those on the other side of the chamber and their allies. And of course, the more money that's locked away from them, the more of their savings that are taken away from them, the more it impacts on their wages today, but also means they can't save for the biggest and most important financial decision in their life, home ownership, because by law we have engaged in a form of economic social engineering where we have prioritised superannuation and the savings for your second most important financial decision ahead of your first. So whenever you hear the crocodile tears from Labor members who talk about how young Australians are finding it harder to buy a home, it is laced with hypocrisy, because they want more of the savings of young Australians to be taken away from them, whether it's to pay for their private health insurance or to be able to save to buy their own home, to build up the nest eggs for which their friends then profit through fees and bonuses. And they won't even report to this parliament what they're getting up to, even though they demand more of working Australians' hard-earned cash. And of course it does come at an expense. It comes at the expense of home ownership. And the hypocrisy doesn't just end there between their claims of concern for young Australians buying their own home and having money locked up in superannuation. The hypocrisy extends to the fact that they, and the member for McNamara this week wrote a paper about how young Australian superannuation savings should be spent on building projects for houses that super funds own that young Australians can then rent to become serfs to their own super. And this is the most despicable shift in economic power in this country's history, where we're seeing the concentration of economic power.
The member for Goldstein has to relate his comments to the bill before the House. I've allowed him to go on for a little while, but I think he should bring it back to the bill.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and of course I am acting utterly consistent with the proposition, which is when you take money from young Australians and lock it up in super, they can't do other things like afford private health insurance and like afford home ownership. And so when you have a situation where you concentrate a huge shift in economic power, it means the choices of young Australians are sacrificed in the process. And it doesn't matter whether it's private health insurance, it doesn't matter whether it's saving to be able to support their family and buy a home. The principle that sits behind it remains the same. And that's why it's the biggest shift of economic power in this country's history, away from the many and in favour of the few, forcing the second most important financial decision or other important financial choices like private health insurance ahead of the most important financial decision that young Australians will make, which is to secure their own home, which is the foundation of their economic security during their working life and through to their retirement, so that on balance they have less costs in their retirement so they can do things like support the payment or the ongoing payment of private health insurance. It reduces the demand of the volume of super that they would then need to be able to do things like forward their living costs and health insurance. So that's why this issue is so critical. We're trying to bridge a gap between one stage of life, but what it'll actually do is extend the gap and build the bridge across that gap for Australian across their entire life cycle to secure their health. Now we need to do the same in other policy areas to respect the natural progress of life. You're born, you get educated, you're raised, you then go into tertiary education, trade or skill, or into the workforce. You find a spouse and have children. You wish to buy your own home as the foundation, the most important financial decision you make in your life. And then following that, you start to look at issues like how to secure your retirement, because of course you can save for your retirement after you buy a home, but you can't afford to save for a home once you're in retirement. and it's a respect for that natural progression of life. And this bill, and acknowledging the contribution of private health insurance, helps to bridge that gap on one factor of the security that people need in their life, not just in their working life, but in their retirement, and goes to the heart of their sense of physical security themselves through their health care. And all I have consistently said is we need to do the same in other areas. But of course, we have the Labor Party that is quite happy for young Australians' savings to be spent on housing that they can rent from super funds, but they do not support young Australians using their own savings to buy their own home. They want Australians to be served to their super like all other government systems. And this is not a sustainable way for a country to go forward unless, of course, you're part of the select few who enjoy the benefits, like IFM Investors, a big financial services firm that pays bonuses in excess of $36 million to single fund members, but we never hear any cries of outrage from members opposite. It's about time we got serious and a bit honest about what's actually happening in this country, where we're seeing concentrations of power going from individuals to big fund managers, and of course the political interests associated with them, and that makes it harder for people to afford private health insurance, makes it harder for them to be able to afford their own home, and that's why it should be, of course, home first, super second, but a critical part of that is private health insurance as well.